So one of the worst feelings is getting denied for a credit card you really wanted and then missing out on a big sign-up bonus, additional rewards, or any other benefits you might have been trying to get. However, the truth is that with the right plan and some knowledge about a few hidden rules we're going to talk about here in this video, you can almost guarantee that you're going to be able to get approved for any credit card on the market, or at the very least, have a high chance of getting any denials reversed. Now, the strategy that I have for getting approved for credit cards is going to be broken up into 3 steps. So step number 1 is to prepare your credit score. Step 2 is to learn the rules. And then the third and final step is to apply and react. So let's go ahead and get started here with preparing your credit score, because most people honestly sort of fail to do a few simple things that could be getting their score in the best shape possible before even applying for a card, which will dramatically increase their approval odds. Now, credit scores are designed to measure your experience with credit, or in other words, they sort of show how good you are at paying back money you owe from things like credit cards and other loans. These scores are calculated by using your credit report from the 3 major bureaus who collect information from your lenders about how exactly you're paying them back. Think of your credit report like a resume. If you were applying for a new job, then you'd probably make sure your resume was not only accurate, but you'd probably also reword a few things and kind of optimize it so that way your resume looks good to whatever company you want to work for, and then hopefully that increases the chances that that company hires you. In the same way you might approach a job application with a well-prepared resume, you also want to approach a credit card application with a well-prepared credit report and credit score. Now, to check on where your credit's currently at, you can just sign up for a free credit monitoring service like Credit Karma, which I like to use for kind of the casual tracking of my score. But you also might want to get a hold of your actual credit report once per year through a site called annualcreditreport.com. That's because under federal law, you're entitled to a copy of your credit report every 12 months from the 3 credit reporting agencies of Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion, and they make access to your report available over on that site completely free of charge. Now, after you've confirmed that your credit information looks accurate, next you want to start optimizing your credit score by just taking a few actions and adjusting some of your behaviors to kind of boost your score to get it up to its full potential. To do that, I've got 3 tips that I try to follow whenever I'm looking to open up any new credit cards myself. So tip number 1 is going to be the easiest, because all you got to do is just make sure you're always paying off your existing credit cards on time and in full by the payment due date each month. You also want to make sure you're making any other monthly payments from other loans you might have on time each month. And that's because on-time payments are going to affect the payment history factor of your credit score. And that is by far the most important factor that accounts for around 35% of your score. Now, if you've got a history of missing payments in the past, then that is going to be something that definitely will hurt your approval odds for a lot of top credit cards. So just be aware there really isn't any magic formula or guaranteed way to fix missed payments on your credit report unless those payments were reported in error. Now, a pro tip here that's always good to mention as well is that if you do happen to miss a payment but you realize it pretty quickly, don't panic, because typically you have around 30 days before that missed payment actually gets reported by a lender to the credit bureaus, which then would start to impact your credit score. So if you're still within that 30-day window, then just go ahead and make that payment ASAP before it gets reported, and also try to remember to set up reminders or auto pay moving forward to avoid any other close calls. Next, tip number 2 for optimizing your credit score is to keep your credit utilization percentage low on each one of your existing credit cards leading up to a new card application, and typically you want to keep this percentage in the low single-digit range if possible. Credit utilization is a large part of the amounts owed factor, which affects around 30% of your credit score, and credit utilization is calculated by just taking the statement balance on the statement closing date of a certain credit card account and then dividing that by the credit limit on that card to get a percentage. Now, even though a lot of the standard advice that you'll read online says 30% or below is going to be a good utilization percentage, when it comes to preparing for a new application, I sort of always recommend actively trying to get that percentage even lower, and ideally, like I said, into the low single digit range. You can do this pretty easily by simply just paying down your credit card balance right before the statement closing date when your statement balance and your credit utilization is calculated. So for example, let's say that today is June 14th and I have a $2,000 balance on one of my existing credit cards right now, which has a $10,000 limit. And then let's also say that my statement closing date on this card is going to be about a week away on June 21st. If I just let my balance stay the way it is, then when June 21st rolls around, that's going to get reported as a 20% credit utilization over to the credit bureaus, which isn't exactly terrible, but it also doesn't look nearly as good as a lower utilization would, even if I still pay off that full $2,000 statement balance before the payment due date a few weeks later, which avoids interest. However, if I simply just paid off maybe $1,900 of my balance a few days before that statement closing date of June 21st, so that way only $100 gets reported as my statement balance on that date, then that's going to be a credit utilization of 1%, which is much more likely to boost my credit score compared to a 20% 20% utilization, and then I could still go ahead and just pay off the remaining $100 statement balance by the payment due date here as well. Now, if you're not planning to apply for any new cards or loans in the coming months, then you don't have to really stress about always keeping credit utilization this low, but otherwise, try this out because this could give your score a solid boost in the short term. Then for tip number 3 with your credit score, I also recommend not applying for new credit cards too often, and that's because of the new credit factor of your score, which affects another 10% of it. You probably noticed that every time you apply for a new card, your credit score takes a small hit and it drops a few points, but that's totally normal and not a bad thing really, because in most situations, the positive effects from having another account with more credit and more potential on-time payments, that's actually going to greatly outweigh those small short-term drops that come from the hard inquiries when you apply for new cards. Those hard inquiries also start to have less of an effect on your score after only a few months, and then they actually fall off your credit report entirely after about 2 years. So my tip here is just to try spacing out how often you apply for new credit cards to kind of account for these hard inquiries. I like to recommend aiming for one new card every 3 to 6 months or so on average for people who are going to be responsible with credit cards and also want to sort of play the credit card game with earning a lot of rewards. But for other people out there who don't really want to manage a ton of credit cards, you can obviously spread that out even longer. Spreading out your new credit cards like this is going to give your credit score enough breathing room to kind of just fall back into its normal level in between your applications. And it also just gives you a lot more time to easily hit any minimum spend requirements for sign-up bonuses, which is important to think about as well. Now at this point, after using some of these tips, hopefully your credit score is at least somewhere in the low to mid 700s or higher, depending on your length of credit history and some other factors. And once your score is in great shape like that, you're going to be much more likely to get approved for most credit cards you might want. However, even with a great credit score, several issuers have sort of these hidden rules and guidelines around which applications they'll approve and which ones they'll deny. So if you really want to move your approval odds higher and higher, it's really going to be important you learn some of these rules and guidelines here with step number 2 in this video. Now, your mileage may vary with a lot of this stuff because some of these rules and guidelines aren't actually published or even advertised by the credit card issuers themselves, but instead, a lot of this is based on data points and real-world experience that people have been sharing online over the years. Sometimes people are able to get around these rules and guidelines, but in general, think of what we're going to talk about next here as sort of a blueprint where if you follow these things and these guidelines, you're going to greatly increase your credit card approval odds compared to someone else who doesn't even know about this stuff. Now, the most well-known application rule in the whole credit card world is from Chase, and it's called the Chase 524 rule. And what this states is that if you've opened 5 or more personal credit cards across all issuers within the past 24 months, you will automatically be denied for any new Chase credit cards. With this one, that means you might want to prioritize getting Chase cards when you know that you're going to be under 524 because they have some really good credit cards out there with nice sign-up bonuses. And then after that, once you're over 524, at that point, you can go ahead and move on to cards from other issuers. Now, if you want to check on your 524 status, you do have to kind of go ahead and do that yourself because Chase isn't just going to tell you this information, but it is super easy to do that just by looking at something like your Credit Karma account to see when exactly your most recent new accounts were opened and how many of those accounts were open in the past 2 years. Chase also seems to have a 230 rule where you can typically only get approved for 2 Chase credit cards within a 30-day period, which means that applying for more than 2 Chase cards over 30 days might not be a great idea. But like I said before, I like to only recommend one new card every 3 to 6 months on average anyway, so if you're roughly following that timeline, then this shouldn't be an issue. Chase also kind of internally calculates how much credit they're willing to give you across the credit limits of all the cards you have with them. And so even if you're following these rules and you've got a really good credit score, you still might not be able to get approved right away because of this. This total amount of credit they want to give you is going to be based on a number of factors, including your income. So a really good bonus tip to kind of keep in mind here when applying for any credit card from any issuer is that they also want to make sure you've got enough income to kind of support whatever credit limit they want to give you. Now for Chase specifically, what's cool with them is that even if you start to run up against that upper limit of the credit they're willing to approve you for, what you could do is actually move around your credit limits from existing cards you have with Chase to a new card with them. I've done this in the past, and sometimes they'll even ask you if you want to do this during the whole application process, but other times you may have to ask to move these limits yourself by just calling the reconsideration line, which is something I'm going to talk about in just a bit here. Next, in terms of rules to know about for Capital One, typically there's 2 you might want to think about, which would be their 2-card rule and the 1-6 rule. The 2-card rule says that Capital One will only approve you for 2 personal credit cards, and that's it. However, this might be a bit of an outdated rule now just because we have seen plenty of data points where this rule doesn't really seem to apply as much anymore. So you might just want to keep this one in mind and not really be too worried about it. But then Capital One also seems to have a 1-6 rule where they will typically only approve you for 1 credit card every 6 months. But again, we have seen some people report data points recently where they were not affected by this rule. So this is going to be another one that might be a good general guideline to follow, but not something that's really enforced as strictly anymore. Then one other general general guideline that's extremely important to mention here with Capital One is they have been known to be very sensitive when it comes to approving people that have what they see as too many recent hard inquiries or too many active credit card accounts on the credit report. I experienced this firsthand myself when I got denied for the Venture X with around 13 active credit card accounts, along with a few other hard inquiries over the previous 24 months leading up to applying for that card. I even tried letting 8 months pass after that denial to sort of let some of those hard inquiries kind of settle a bit before reapplying, but still I got denied once again for the same exact reason of having too many accounts, even though my credit score was up around 800. What's interesting though is that my wife Jackie then immediately applied after me with only like 5 credit cards on her report, and she got approved for the Venture X with no questions asked. And I'm not alone in experiencing Capital One denials as someone with many credit cards and a great credit score, because I've received a ton of comments and a ton of DMs from other people out there who got denied under similar conditions. So my best advice here to increase Capital One approval odds is going to be to look into getting their credit cards earlier on in your credit card journey if possible. And if you're worried about whether or not they would approve you, a good thing to know about here is that Capital One does have a pretty decent pre-approval tool that you can find over on their website. So you can go ahead and use that tool to kind of see where exactly you're at with them before actually applying. As always though, just to say this again, your mileage may vary, but if I could start over, I would definitely get my Chase credit cards first, just like I did while being under 524, and then I would immediately move over to Capital One cards to increase my approval odds. Now next here for Citi credit cards, they have one primary rule to be aware of, which is going to be the 865 rule, and that rule states that Citi will likely not approve you for more than 1 card during an 8-day period or more than 2 cards in a 65-day period. Again, there could be people who have experienced exceptions to the timelines within this rule, but I would try to follow these timelines with Citi if you can for the best results because they're pretty easy to follow. Citi is also known to be pretty inquiry sensitive, so if you have too many hard inquiries from opening up new cards over the past 6 months or so, you might just want to let that cool off a little bit before applying to also improve your approval chances. For American Express, they don't really have any super limiting rules in my opinion, so a couple of guidelines they do have usually have been that you can't get more than 5 credit cards with Amex that have a credit limit on them, and then you also can't get more than 10 non-credit limit cards like the Platinum or Gold cards. You also generally won't be able to get approved for more than 2 Amex cards with credit limits in 90 days, which is known as the 290 rule. But a lot of the other big Amex rules to know about are more centered around who's eligible for different welcome offers. For example, they have a once per lifetime welcome bonus rule on most cards where typically you're only going to be able to get 1 bonus per card in your life unless you come across an offer without that language in the terms. And there's actually a bunch of other welcome bonus rules with all the issuers out there as well, like the Chase 48-month Sapphire rule and the Citi 48-month rule. Lots of these rules around sign-up bonuses might affect the order you want to apply for certain cards and how you kind of time those applications. But since I want to keep this video just moving along and mainly focus on increasing approval odds, what my team and I did was we made a free PDF with all these credit card application and welcome bonus rules combined in one place. You could go ahead and check out that free PDF at the link down below in the description underneath the subscribe button. So if you haven't already, definitely go ahead and make sure to subscribe to this channel as well because we're trying to reach 200,000 subscribers, so thank you in advance. All right, now after steps 1 and 2, we can go ahead and move on to the fun third step here, which is going to be to finally apply and then react to the credit card application decision you receive. But before you even apply, you want to make sure you're choosing the right credit card as well. To do that, make sure you're applying for a card that fits your spending habits and also has either no annual fee or an annual fee with credits or benefits that provide you more value than the card costs to hold each year. We've got a ton of videos here on the channel that go over the best credit cards on the market, so you can go ahead and check those out after watching this video if you need some help with that. But once you decide on the right credit card for you and you click the submit button on your application, you're gonna see a message that says one of 3 things. First, it might say approved, which is great. Congrats on the new credit card, and now you just want to use it responsibly, and then also make sure you're keeping track of any progress to reach any minimum spend requirement. That way you can receive whatever welcome bonus the issuer may have offered you. The second thing that your application could say is that your application is under review, and that just means that you're probably going to have to wait a few days for the issuer to reach an approval or a denial decision, which might seem a little bit frustrating at first. Don't panic though, because those kinds of messages are completely normal and they don't automatically mean you're getting denied. So instead, it might just mean that they need more time or more information before making a decision, or they could just be making sure that it's actually you applying and not some sort of fraud. Just give the application a few days to kind of sit around while it's under review. That way you can see if they come to a decision on their own. But if you don't hear anything back after a few days, then what I've done in the past is I've called something known as an issuer's reconsideration line, which we'll talk more about in just a minute. And then the third thing that you might see from an issuer after applying is obviously a message that just flat out tells you that your application was denied. However, again, this is typically not the end of the road here because the reconsideration line that I just mentioned is going to be another another resource that you could possibly use to potentially reverse your decision. Now, if you're denied, then you're going to receive a notice or a letter either online or by mail that kind of explains your reason for denial. And having this notice before calling the reconsideration line can actually be pretty useful because you're going to have some time to sort of prepare for your call with customer service to explain why they should go ahead and reverse their denial to an approval. For example, let's say you applied for a Chase card and you were denied immediately for having too many recent new accounts. So if we look back at the 524 rule that we talked about before, then that sounds like it could be the reason here. But let's also say that you did your homework and maybe you even saw this video and you know that you've only opened 4 new credit cards in the last 24 months. However, now that you think about it and you look at your credit report again, you weren't actually counting the authorized user card that your wife added you to from for her account last year. There's a good chance that Chase saw that account and that might have caused them to automatically add that towards your 524 number, which then got flagged in their system and led to the denial. This is actually a pretty common mix-up though, and again, you might be able to get it fixed by just calling their customer service number or their reconsideration line directly now that you've gone ahead and prepared and kind of thought about your reason for denial. And then you just ask them to not count that authorized user card as a recent new account for you since you're not the primary cardholder responsible for that account. With that new information, they might be able to go ahead and just reverse their decision and approve you on the spot. And there's going to be a number of other ways that you could politely make your case for reversing a denial just by calling for reconsideration. But obviously, they're not going to say yes every time because, again, your mileage may vary and some reasons for denial are going to be more difficult to overcome than others. However, remember that if you don't call reconsideration, then that basically locks you in with a 100% chance of denial. But if you do call for reconsideration, then at least you're getting some sort of a chance for approval, which is better than nothing. The worst thing they can do is say no, so it just never hurts to ask. And if a credit card issuer cannot reverse a denial, then you might just have to come to sort of better understand why you were denied in the first place, and then just be patient and try to fix that issue if possible to reapply at some point in the future. You might even want to think about having a plan B in place like I did when I got denied for the Capital One Venture X. So like I said before, I just had my wife apply and get approved for that card, and then she added me as a free authorized user to have basically all the benefits I needed from that card, like 2x miles on everything and access to Capital One airport lounges. Again, the goal with this video is just for anyone to take the information we talked about here and then sort of stack all these tips together to greatly increase your chances of getting approved for any credit card you want. But remember, it all starts with getting your credit score in great shape like we talked about with step number 1. So if you want my full in-depth guide on how to increase your credit score dramatically with even more detail on how to get an 800 plus credit score, then make sure to go ahead and check out this video over here next. But as always, thanks so much for watching and I'll see you in the next one.